Great. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. We know happy hours soon. It's a long day. Thank you for taking the time. Looking forward to it. Do you want to introduce yourself,
Yeah.
Heidi?
I'm Heidi. I'm the commute specialist at Tableau. So my job is to manage parking and transportation, everything related to commute for employees, bike room, things like that. My job today is really going to be to outline the survey data that we have on our employees' commute behavior and then what we do with that, as well as this really unique public-private partnership that we've been working on to help other companies also understand their commute data and plan their benefits around that.
Yeah, my name is Will Pitzler. I'm a consultant with Tableau's professional services, and I moved back to the US in January, and I magically had a parking spot, and naturally I got an email in my inbox saying, hey, we need help with the dashboard from the commute team. And lo and behold, I thought it was going to be a quick, let's get a couple-hour polish session. It turned into a 6-month project with various stakeholders throughout Seattle, and also a really helpful tool internally for Heidi. So I will be approaching it more from the technical side. On the technical piece, I just want to give, I don't know how everyone else's sessions are going. This isn't a hands-on training, so I understand you're going to get bombarded with a lot of information. I don't expect you to teach me how to use Tableau Prep after this session, okay? I just want you to have a few key takeaways, which I'll talk through here in a minute. So why don't we do that now? First of all, conceptual. Heidi mentioned we're going to talk about the project itself with Commute Seattle and also what we're doing internal at Tableau. So you're going to get a multifaceted approach in regards to this project. We'll talk about common pitfalls with using Tableau Prep. When we started this, Tableau Prep was in its infancy. So it was a new tool. It was actually in beta when we first looked at it, and we thought, hey, what a neat opportunity for us to take a look at it. Also, we're going to pass this off to Commute Seattle to manage themselves. They do not have really hard coding data analysts. They don't have anyone that knows SQL. They can't use Alteryx. And so we wanted to keep the process simple for the business user. So we'll talk about how we did that. We'll get into dashboard design best practices. So we'll talk a little bit about what went into that. And I know if you're familiar working with dashboards frequently, it's never done, right? People always complain, want something different. So we'll talk about those iterations and how we manage that process. And then lastly, we'll also talk about how we leverage Tableau Public to quote unquote securely share data. Are there any IT people in the room? A couple? I put security in quotes, okay? We're not talking enterprise level governance here. We're using Tableau Public, which is free. Everybody likes free, okay? Clients are always like, oh, we love public. As we know, there's no security built into Tableau Public, but we came up with a little algorithm in Excel that actually randomized these codes for these employers that they only have access to. And so we'll kind of walk you through that process. I've seen consultants do something similar with the use of parameters, and so we'll share that piece as well. Okay. We'll hold time at the end for a ton of questions. I know it's the end of the day, but we'll also intermittently stop to ask questions. All right, so
Cool.
How do you want to start us off?
Yeah. So Seattle, a once drippy grunge town home to Boeing and trees, is now a bustling tech hub. And with that comes big city challenges. So what is our role as a tech company in mitigating some of those issues when we're, partially responsible for 1,000 new residents coming to the city each week? So we believe that any company with commute or with climate goals or recruitment and retention goals should care about how their employees are getting to work. Housing prices have nearly doubled in 3 years in the city, so more and more people are looking outside of the area. And we know that in a tight economy, when jobs are plentiful, people will make a switch to a new job for a smaller improvement in their life, a smaller increase in pay or better benefits, including a better commute. And we care about that. And we know that we're not alone. There are other companies in the city, large institutions, who are now required to demonstrate that they're reducing their drive alone rate in order to expand the footprint of their business. And there are companies, I can think of 5 offhand in the last year, who have publicly stated that they're moving downtown for better transit access and in order to recruit and retain employees. So we are at the same time a little bit unique because the city of Seattle is the only large metro area that is seeing an increase in transit ridership and a decrease in the drive alone rate. And in some ways that means that we have to adapt our benefits in a different way than we're doing in other cities. So being a data company, we had a data idea. What if we could access some unique survey data that I'll get into in a minute and build a dashboard so that we could better understand our employees' commute behaviors and then also help other companies in the area understand their commute benefits and understand how their employees are getting to work so that we can all have a positive impact on the traffic issues that we're facing in the city. So we reached out to an organization called Commute Seattle. They're a transportation management association. A lot of cities have an entity like this. In this case, it's a nonprofit. They help employers with their commute programming. And Commute Seattle also oversees a really unique state law which requires employers that have over 100 employees to survey those employees, ask them how they're getting to work each day, and why they're making those decisions. And then employers are required to build programming to influence those commute behaviors. So this law has been really key to Seattle being able to drive down that drive alone rate and increase transit ridership. And that's also, that survey then is the source of the data that we're talking about today. So companies have a goal, a drive alone goal or a target that they're expected to meet. And we are, again, surveying every 2 years and then building programming around those goals. And those goals are set depending on your neighborhood and the transit access that you have. So until now, this data has really been locked up in a state database and not really usable in any helpful form. In fact, after surveying, about 2 months later, we would get a report back that looked like this. What am I supposed to do with that? I can see that 53% of our employees are driving alone and the rest are taking other modes, but obviously this is pretty static. I can't really drill down and uncover much that is helpful. Here's a little bit more of the information I got. Maybe I could use this for some messaging, but we can do better. So luckily I found a willing volunteer who was able to help me build a one-of-a-kind dashboard that I think will be really cutting edge and one of the most sought-after benchmarking tools in the country once it's fully executed. So with that, let's talk about the state of the data. So once we got our hands on the data, we realized what a big project we actually had in front of us. So we're talking about employee responses to 10 or 15 questions, but from 275 companies. So part of the challenge is also the partnership. Commute Seattle is represented as that nonprofit in the middle of this diagram, but they have funding partners including the city, the county, Sound Transit is the local train system, as well as businesses in the downtown core. And so the complexities are real, and we needed to build something that was good for all of these partners that they could sign off on and would be useful for the companies. So I'm going to let Will dive into some of the more technical aspects now.
Sure. You know, when Heidi first approached me, she said, you can reduce traffic congestion and get rid of pie charts. So I was like, sweet, 2 things I hate. Also, we thought, hey, the data, it's going to be simple, easy to access, no worries. It was anything but that. I imagine within your own organization, think about how difficult it is to get data from everyone, let alone 3 different government organizations at once. So we met probably about 12 to 24 times over the course of 6 months, getting our hands on this data. Came from every which way. We actually ended up with 6 different data sources. We extracted it all into flat files. Again, we were working with Tableau Prep. The reason we were doing that is because we're going to pass this off to Commute Seattle so that they can easily manage it. Again, I'll say it another time. There's a lot of details in this presentation. You're going to get the slides after the fact, so don't worry about trying to, follow along or anything like that. You'll get to look at it at the end if you need to. But some of the common problems that come up with survey data quite frequently. So I'm going to ruin the surprise. At a high level, what we have is we have employee data from 2 different years, 2015-16 and 17-18. We get data from employers. This is the survey that Heidi was talking about, companies from all around Seattle, 200 and something different companies that say, what benefits do you provide to employers, right? How do you make yourself more competitive in a really competitive tech environment? Well, benefits is one way. And so that's a employer survey. And then we have a security table, which I will talk about towards the end, that we just built in Excel. So at the end of the day, 5 different sources. We brought it together into one easily accessible and manageable data source. So what did it look like in the end? I'll ruin it for you. This was it. So I think when I first showed this to the person that's going to take on this project, she was like, what am I supposed to do with this? It's really not complicated, I promise you. Okay? I'm going to walk you through this. And more than anything, how many of you are working with survey data today? You're in a survey. Okay, mostly everybody. You're going to see a lot of these problems. I'm sure you're nodding your head in agreement. Some of this might be very simple for some of you. It might be very complex for others. I'm going to do my best to synthesize this concisely, quickly, and hopefully it just makes sense so that when you hear some of these takeaways, you're able to jot down some notes. We'll provide some links at the end, and of course, I'll try to intermittently ask questions as we go. So first, let's tackle one corner of this, and let's talk a little bit about the survey data. So Heidi, from Tableau's HR perspective, what is this employee survey data and why do we care?
Yeah, so we would just send out a link to everyone in the company asking them to take a quick 5-minute survey. It was probably about 10 questions long, and we're required to get 70% response rate on that survey. But so we had there's tons of great information in there that we could learn from, but all we got back was that 4-page PDF document. So part of our goal here was to get our hands on that survey data and for everyone's benefit, come up with something a bit more useful and illustrative.
Yeah, and historically what Commute Seattle would do is they would go meet with these organizations after these surveys were revealed. They'd have one-on-one appointment, and any data that they didn't have in their PDF stack, they'd then have to go back to their DBA, get that data pulled, 3 weeks later send them the data. So now it's a very iterative process, and they actually have a portal where employers can log in at any time throughout the year as that survey is updated. They don't have to wait to meet with Commute Seattle. They can get their data at the speed of thought. So let's first talk about this employee data. I think there were 47 different columns in this Excel document and a couple 100,000 rows of data. And when we first got the data, we didn't even know what they meant. They just said column A, column B, column C, and we had no idea what they were. So in addition to that, we got a Word document. It was kind of like a puzzle, figuring out which column corresponded with what, and then figuring out in this first rendition of this dashboard, what's important. So some of the biggest companies in Seattle, we actually went and worked with them to say, hey, what do you really care about in this version 1? And what are some of the key data questions that you need? So when we were finally narrowing it down, we came away with about 10 different questions that we wanted to answer. And in general, they were in decent, row data. So each employee would take a survey, they would provide a response in row level format. There were a couple of questions in particular that weren't the case. So if you can see, I know it's difficult to see in the back, but column F through column L are days of the week. Okay, and each one of those days, if you work with SurveyMonkey, this is a common problem that you find. The data does not come in a structure that's easily managed in Tableau, so we are going to pivot this data, all right? What does that do to the length of our data when we pivot data? Anyone? Long. Yeah, I heard about 8 different answers. I'm sorry I asked that and everyone responds, but you're thinking, so good. Yeah, we're going to pivot the data. This whole section down here is pivoting. The data was really messy, okay? This is probably the most common thing that you're going to do when we work with survey data. So what does the data actually entail? There's actually only 2 questions that we were dealing with here. One of the questions was, did you commute between the hours of 6 to 9 a.m. every day? Why do we care about that? Well, we're finding out which companies are flexible in regards to commute times. How do we reduce that congestion? Question 4 is, how did you get to work every day? Each company, depending on their neighborhood, their industry, their location, has a specific threshold for their drive alone rate. That's a really important number. So how are these employees getting to work? So if you look at the middle column, you're going to see, I think, 14 different measures, one for each day of the week. We are going to pivot that data. So instead of having 7 columns and 1 row per employee, we're going to have 7 rows of data per employee and only 3 columns. Day of the week, which helps both questions, question 2 and question 4. And then we're also going to have the mode split. Whenever I reference mode split, that just means how do you get to work? Do you drive? Do you walk? Do you take one of those 2-wheel scooters? And then yes or no. Do you commute between the hours to 6 to 9 a.m.? Once we do that, we have 2 pivots. We have question 4. We have question 2 for 2 different years of survey data. So again, I'm going to show you the flow as we go. But every time we pivot, we get pivot field names and pivot field values. How many of you see measure names and measure values on a day-to-day basis? Okay, I won't ask you to describe what it is. It's actually really hard to describe. But in short, we just took those 7 columns and pivoted them into 2. So the pivot field values, even though it's a categorical question, how do you get to work every day? They came in as numbers. So we actually, in prep, we renamed those fields so that the desktop user didn't even have to think about it. And then pivot field names, you can see that it says 4_Sunday, 4_Thursday. That's because it's related to question 4. So we weren't done. Even though we had that pivot, no one wants to work with pivot field values and pivot field names. From there, we had a cleaning step. I'm going to dive into this in just a second. On the right-hand side, we're going to clean the data. So we pivot those 2 questions. We leave all the questions alone except for those 2 questions that we care about. We pivot them, and then we're going to add a cleaning step. So what you'll see, it looks really messy and overwhelming when you're looking at Tableau Prep. How many of you have used Tableau Prep to this point? Yeah, pretty good, about half, awesome. I don't know, I didn't have a better naming step, but rename yes or no. So what we're doing, we're splitting fields here. We actually wrote a calculation. On the left-hand side, again, I apologize, it's blurry, we have a lot going on. It has the company code. It really has 4 different columns for each one of these pivots because we have 2 questions for 2 years. So what do? Once we have our 4 different columns, we have to combine them. So for each year, we want to combine question 2 and question 4 into one table that has the year, the name of the employer, the employee name, days of the week, and did you commute or how are you getting to work. So you'll see over on the right-hand side, there are 2 full outer joins, combining question 2 and question 4 for each year. The last step is we're going to union. If you haven't heard the term union, essentially what you're doing is you're just appending. So you have question 2 and question 4 in those outer joins. In each year, we union them together, and we've solved our problem with those 2 questions that were not formatted appropriately, and we have completed that first section. So it looks ominous, it looks daunting. In reality, you could have actually probably done it in Tableau Desktop back in the day, but it's a much more simple process to go through. And the nice part, now that we have it on server, they can just go ahead and schedule it. So when they get the next year's data, they just replace data sources, and it's going to do the exact same thing as long as that survey structure stays the same. So we'll do a lot of questions at the end. Are there any high-level questions on this first part? You guys are like, I just want to go to dinner. Yeah.
Does everybody take the same survey? Like each company provides the exact same questions?
You can, if you give the state an insane amount of advance notice, you can add up to 3 of your own unique questions, but most people don't do that.
Good question. Thank you for kicking off the questions. Okay. No one else is afraid to talk now. So next step, we have some employer data. So beyond the individual responses that these employees are given, again, we only handled 2 of the 30 questions that we were looking at. We also had employer data, arguably the most important part. So Heidi, do you want to talk a little bit about, from Tableau's perspective, what do we do with that data and why do we care?
Yeah, so it includes employer geographic location, and that will come in handy when we create a map later on. And then the other is a program report, which was basically a SurveyMonkey tool where we filled out, do we provide parking? Is that parking free? If not, how much do we charge for it? Do we provide transit passes, showers, lockers, things like that? Up until this point, we never saw any output from that, so there was no ability to see how we could benchmark ourselves against other companies. And as you can imagine, that's like the very next question somebody's going to want to know once you fill out that report. It's like, oh, it'd be really great to know what other people are doing. At the same time, other companies are not going to want you to be able to look at exactly what their benefits are because that's a competitive advantage for them. So this was a really sticky situation where we wanted to be able to build some sort of a benchmarking tool, but we had to make sure that it was anonymous enough that companies couldn't figure out exactly who they were comparing themselves to. So that comes in handy later. But it was basically a Google Doc that we received it in.
And Tableau connects to Google Docs. So that was very easy. So we're going to break this down into part 2. So part 1 was just those 2 questions. We're now going to add a little bit more together. I told you it was just employer data. That was a lie. We have still another 12 questions or so that we wanted to add from that employee data. Where are you located? What's your postal code? So we can see where our employees are coming from. How far do you travel every day? Those are the types of questions that we still want to get from employees. But the nice part, it was a simple columnar format. So there's the question, there's the response for each row-level employee. So we didn't have to do anything to it. But we also want to bring in that employer data that Heidi talked about. So latitude and longitude coordinates, we want to map this. We actually now have shape files, which we're able to connect to directly, which is really helpful. Proximity to bus routes, bike stops. Heidi's going to talk about how we actually use that every single day. And then other benefits. Do you offer transit passes? What percentage of other companies offer that as well? Okay, so all differentiating factors that are going to help arm these, sorry Heidi, other companies in Seattle to compare their benefits. So let's talk a little bit about that employer data and some of the challenges that we had there. There we are. So we tackled the bottom left. Let's look at that top portion. To start with, I told you there's a few other employee questions that we wanted to answer. The nice part, this was simple. Okay, it was just every single employee had a row, and there was a column for a question. All we did was a union. We just took those 2 years of data, stacked them on top of one another, and for those of you that use prep every day, when we do a union, we know that we want to look at each one of those columns. It's hard to see, I know, I apologize, people in the back, but you'll see that blue and gold bars for every single column. That validates the fact that, hey, we have data in each one of those columns, and they do, in fact, line up. From there, we're going to join in the employer data. Now, I want you to think about this. Let's say for each employer, we have 100 rows of data because of all of their employees. Let's just say 100 employees were surveyed. We're going to join in that employer data on each individual employee. So that employer information, if we have 100 employees responding to that survey, we're going to have 100 rows of the same data from the employer. So if Tableau employee 1, it's going to show Tableau's information. Tableau employee 2, Tableau's information. So we're going to have a lot of aggregation issues, which we could have handled here. We actually took the approach of using level of detail calculations in Tableau Desktop to handle the aggregation issues. Huge issue with survey data is, when you're working with these questions, you're going to have varying levels of aggregation, a really important thing to pay attention to. If you don't know what level of detail calculations are, there's all sorts of good trainings. They're very helpful to help with the level of aggregation. Simple, okay? The top part, we just join those two fields in. I will talk a little bit about, somewhere. It's gone. Where did it go? I will come back to that portion. Long story short, we joined on the company name. Okay, so that company that employee was from, that was the field that we joined by. And once we do that, we get to combine it all together. So I'll take 2 steps back. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to quickly change the screen. Look at that top portion on the far right. You'll see that icon for join to. That's the very last step that has all of the rest of the employee data and the employers. And on the bottom, you'll see that there's a union, a blue union in the middle. We have to combine all of that data together. So the join, when we talk about levels of aggregation, was an issue with this. So we actually had to join these fields on 3. So when you're joining fields from different levels of aggregation, pay attention to what are the common fields and what is the aggregation of your data. So in this case, we joined on CTR code or EID again. You're going to see this in just a minute. EID just means what is that company's survey code. So Tableau has a code. It's an E code, E prefixed with 6 different numbers. Every employer gets one from the city. Record number is employee number, okay? So for every single company, you're going to have record number 1, record number 2, record number 3. So it's not a one-to-one relationship for that individual employee. And then table names, I didn't do a good job of renaming. Essentially, table names is year, because we've got 2 years of survey data. So we had to make sure that we joined on the appropriate data, or you're going to get some really interesting results of your survey. Once we create that join, it was good. Okay? We actually got together, we started building out some dashboards, and then at the end they said, oh, we're actually sharing this in a portal. I said, oh, are we? Okay. A lot of deliberation went around. Various companies had different opinions. Do we want to get Tableau server spun up and share it? A lot of companies didn't want their data with Commute Seattle. Again, I will preface this by saying all of this data is actually public. So we're not at the risk of exposing any sensitive employee information at all. If a company did get a hold of another company, it's not the end of the world. And we also anonymize the dashboard enough where even if you were to get someone else's information, which you wouldn't be able to tell who it is other than maybe what's part of the city they're located in, which doesn't help too much. But I do want to talk about a nice technique that actually pacified all of the stakeholders and enabled us to actually leverage Tableau Public, which is free. Everybody smiled. And we're able to actually put the solution up on Tableau Public so that each one of these companies, Heidi included, can log in and take a look at their dashboard. I was warned when I went through this once, this is relatively complex. I'll say it for a 3rd time because I know you're probably tired. You're going to get these slides at the end so you can see how I did it. I'm going to try to go through this very slowly, and I will pause for questions at the end, walk you through how we did this. So to start with, you'll see on the left-hand side there's an EID column in column A. That is the EID code for every single company. First of all, I've anonymized this, so don't worry about these numbers. But there is a very strict format, an E followed by 5 letters in chronological order. So what we did is, because we want to make it easy to maintain, we actually just replicated those numbers all the way down for 1 million records in Excel. So that Commute Seattle, if they get another company, they don't have to try to create this algorithm again. They can just pop in the company name and align it with a CTR code, which we're going to supply. First step, we just stripped off the E, because we're going to start making some manipulations to this number. They weren't comfortable with just putting the E code up there, because lots of people in each company have an E code. If one employee were to go to another company, they would know it. So they wanted it longer and more complex. So we went and got 2 completely random numbers from the National Institute of Standards. You're probably wondering, why do we have a number that's 12.4.6.32 quadrillion, whatever that is? They are completely random numbers. There's a random number generator that we used, and we found a number with good length that had enough variety. And then the second factor was 643. We want to make this number longer. So what we did is we took that integer, that EID code that we stripped off the E, we multiplied it by the 2 factors there, and divided it by 10 to the 19th power. And you're probably wondering why. I'm not a mathematician. I was a political science major, if you can believe it. 10 to the 19th power, the only reason that we did that was just so that we could get an appropriate length. They wanted something at least 10 integers long. They weren't comfortable with 5. It's actually funny. At the very end, they came back and said, actually, it's fine. We don't need 10. But now they have 10. So we have these really long numbers. You'll notice when you look closely at them at the end, they are still in chronological order, okay? So, and they still didn't want all numbers as their code. If you were to get a hold of that formula, it's not very complicated. Multiply 3 numbers and divide it by 10 to the 19th. There wasn't enough variation. So from there, we used a hexadecimal number. What this is, it's a random numbering system that essentially supplies alphanumeric values based on the number. So any number that's 0 to 9, it gives a 0 to 9. Any number that's 10 to 15 will apply A through F. So it's now mixing in numbers and letters to generate a code. It sounds complicated. It's used commonly in math and computer science. In Excel, it's just base 16. And I'm not going to get too far into the calculation. We'll give you some links at the end if you want to go nerd out and look at that calculation. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking that number and we're applying alphanumeric values. But if you look at that hex, it's still 3A0, 3A0, 3A0. There's still not enough variation. So the last step and the most key to this whole thing is we used a random and then sort function in Excel to completely scramble those hex codes. So if alphabetically those companies were A, B, C, and it was scrolling down through those numbers, when we apply that random function, it's going to, one time, scramble all of those codes into any which order. Every time you open that Excel doc, it's going to scramble them. So we did one scramble based on completely random numbers in column G that will never be replicated again. We saved that document. So now if anyone were to even go back through, figure out those random numbers, they wouldn't be able to generate those Excel random values that we randomly used in Excel. I'll pause at the end. We're almost there, okay? From there, that gets us our code. We put a CTR on the front. Those codes are now completely scrambled. It's no longer just 310 all the way down. And we lined it up with the company EID code, which I've anonymized for the purposes of this presentation. That is their code in order to log into Tableau Public, which I will show you in a minute. I know it's happy hour and it's really difficult to focus, and that was a lot of steps. I'll pause for just a second. Are there any questions on that? Yeah?
So did you have to spin up a separate instance in each dashboard for logging purpose?
Great question. Yeah, great question. No, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. We actually used a popping parameters technique. So we used a data source filter that said, hey, if your code equals whatever you enter, show data or don't show any data at all. Great question. So yeah, thank you for asking that. I'll show you in just a minute. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned that when you were joining those two data sets together at the beginning, the survey data and the company data,
Yep.
were you joining
Good question. Well, they're unique, so it's the same thing. We joined on the question was, did we join on the company name or that code that's supplied by the state? There's actually replications, so Tableau actually has 3 offices in this greater Seattle area. They each have their own unique code. So we actually joined on the company code because those are unique.
Just wondering if you guys are doing fuzzy matching.
Yeah, no, it's nice that it's nice and clean, so we have a unique number for each individual company. Yeah. Okay, now we'll get to the fun part. Lastly, we just joined in those codes. So each E-code had one of those long calculation numbers that we created, and we joined it back to our table with all of our employee data, and the employer also has that CTR code. So it was easy to join it back in. And again, they never have to touch that code's data source again unless they want to add another company. And we actually found out at the end they're going to let companies choose their own code, so it all sounds for naught, but I thought it'd be fun to show it in a presentation. So they can change the code if they need to, something that they might be able to remember, but it really gave people peace of mind to be willing to share their company data up on Tableau. So, to answer the gentleman's question in the back, how did we actually get this? And we'll show it in action in just a second. We did actually replicate the data. I'll talk about it in a minute. So we have duplicates of the same data source. But what we did is if you look on the left, we have a calculation called secure flag that just says, hey, if the code, which is in the data set, that the company code matches the code we type in the parameter, then 1 else 0, which says show data or not. So when you apply it as a data source filter, if you want to Google, if you don't use those, data source applies to the entire workbook. So all dashboards in a workbook, it'll either show the data or nothing will show up. So if any of you go out and try to log into the dashboard up on Commute Seattle, hopefully you'll be able to see anyone's company data, unless you have that long CTR code. So we're going to show you what we ended up with, but are there any other questions on this process? I know we went through a lot in 30 minutes. We're going to get into dashboard design and some more fun things, but any other questions? Mm-hmm.
When you join the question 2 and question 4, so basically it's like, I'm just thinking about the layout of the data. So for question 2 column, you had it by whatever from Sunday to Saturday, and then again it repeats for the next year, right?
Yeah.
And so then you have question 2, question 4, and then additional questions, but all of their answers are in that column. Pertaining to
Yeah, good question. So if you look at the, see if I can go, oh, that's going to be a long time. Okay. The bottom left portion, you see where these, I don't know, I'm short, but these bars right here, so they are actually the same exact structure of data. There's 7 columns. And if you work with multiple measures in Tableau, it's really difficult to work with 7 different columns of data. So what we did is each year has question 2 and question 4. There's 14 columns, right? One question has 7 columns. The other question has 7 columns. The other year has 14 different columns as well. When we restructure it, they're going to have another column that actually says year and year, so that they do match up vertically, but they're different years of data. Does that help answer? Okay. Yeah, good question. Any others? Sweet as. Okay. Let's show this. Nope.
While he's working on that, I can tell you the dashboard did 3 big things for us. One, it's mobile, so we can share it throughout the company, up the leadership chain to help inform decisions. The other, it created a benchmarking tool so that we can see how our benefits stack up against other companies. And then lastly, it pulled out the most important information from the employee survey, which is the map where people are coming from and then how they're getting to work.
So this is what you'll see. I'm working on a screen I can't see here. There we go. We're in presentation mode. If you go onto Commute Seattle's website, this is now in action. They're actually starting the second version of this dashboard. They're just creating more questions. They're building in, making this even more informative. But this was the first one that they ran by various companies to good levels of success. When you log into Tableau Public, this is what you're going to see, okay? If you type anything into that box that doesn't align with a company code, it's just going to show up blank. It actually says no data available. If you go to any one of the tabs at the bottom, there's no data. That's because of that parameter that we used on the data source that says if the parameter matches the code that's in the data, then show, else nothing. We have a random code here. So if you try to write it down, it's not going to work after this. Once we hit enter, hopefully. I can't see a thing here. There we go. Once you type in that company code, up pops 2 different images that they can click on based on the question that they're asking of their data. So we'll start with the performance dashboard. Okay. So remember that employer data that we talked about, looking at where, are you close to a bike path, a bus route, those types of questions. Also employee data of where they're coming from. So we can figure out, hey, we have a large quantity of employers that are working here. How can we alleviate any transit obstacles that we have? Did you want to start or do you want me to start?
I can show, one of the most exciting things for me is the tooltip, vision tooltip, where you can now see how many people are coming from a specific zip code and how they're getting to work each day. So that is really helpful for benefits planning. I could overlay this in future iterations. We'd like to bring in the transit routes through GIS, and maybe even it'd be pretty easy to bring in the train system and even potentially bike lanes. And then we could see where are the holes in the system and how could we, maybe provide some incentive for people who live really close to the office but are still driving. What could we offer them that maybe gets them to try something different? So that's one benefit. One thing that we're doing with this already is that in the city of Seattle, we're about to take down a large elevated highway and replace it with a tunnel. And when that happens, it will be a massive disruption for 3 to 6 weeks, potentially longer. And then that tunnel will be tolled after that as well. So during this process, we can expect people's commutes to maybe double, maybe triple, maybe worse. And so the city is encouraging employers to let people telework and carpool and do all kinds of things. So we basically have been able to use this map and marry it with our HR data where we actually can figure out where people, attach those zip codes to actual people. And then invite all those people that might be affected to a brown bag where they can, meet a new carpool buddy and take a survey about whether or not they would take an employee shuttle. So that's one thing we're doing with this already.
Yeah, from a design perspective, they were very particular with their colors. So you're probably looking at this and you're probably thinking, oh, you should go to visual analytics class. I tried, okay? We got rid of pie charts, but now we have lots of colored bars. I say less is more when it comes to color in general, right? Save bright colors for things that you want to alert to. I love gray, okay? All 50 shades. But for this case, if you look at the walked bike, they have a very specific color scheme and icons that they had to use. So I really wanted to take back the color, but they said we also want a map. First of all, it does actually answer the question, where are people coming from when you zoom in? But it's also eye candy. When people see this, they're like, oh, that's interesting, it draws you in. And that was some of the first comments that we got. We kept the key KPIs, those key indicators, just in very small text up at the top. But in general, it provides a nice, easy, clean to use dashboard to dive into. And again, this was just version 1, but kind of think of some of those things when you're designing. Let's talk about the next one, and then we'll dive in for any last questions. Heidi, I'll start, I guess, on this one. So this is the employer scorecard. So every single employee can actually see how they're doing compared to the rest of the employers in their neighborhood, which is the column on the left, the bar chart on the left, and then in their industry. So this mock company is a technology company on the right-hand side. And then they have that KPI. And again, I went to battle over the use of those, but they've really had it. They love checks and X's and all those. They want the Unicode and the title, all those descriptive things. But long story short, they were also asking, hey, we want to be able to print this and take this in. Change is hard in an organization. And if you've been using pie chart printouts for 35 years and someone shows you this, you're not going to know where to start. So we did want to make it so, yes, you can hover and you can see more detail with the use of tooltip. I always say be more descriptive. Tell people what you want them to do. You look at your data all the time. Some of these people might look at it once a year. So be overly descriptive as to when you're designing these things, what do you want people to do with it? But they did have to print. But we actually show 27 different questions in one dashboard, and I might be a little biased. I don't think it's too overwhelming, right? You can easily answer the question that you're looking at, and you get that comparison. So you can see those percentage. If you look at that top, it says Orca Passport, which is basically a transit pass. Only 25% of companies in that neighborhood provide that, and this mock company doesn't either. So gives you a benchmark on how you're comparing.
Yeah, so I've already heard their company is using this for their 2019 budget planning. It just provides a really nice snapshot of where you're at and gives you just something to anchor those budget requests in. I'm curious also, you know, we have bike share in the city now where you've probably seen the bikes around here too, those blue bikes that you can check out. We have our own loaner bikes that we let people check out, but they've gotten less and less use over the last year, I think, as bike shares become more popular. And so we've proposed trading those out and just giving people coupons for bike share instead. And I'm curious, you know, how other companies adapt to that. And we'll be able to update this pretty soon because people just finished their program reports for this year and then see how things have changed.
Yeah.
What about companies that have lots of locations like Starbucks or the school district where they have many, many locations that they might want to see all of them or the individual?
I can talk about it from design, and then you could probably talk a little bit more about why they choose to do it the way they do. The purposes of this survey, it's a requirement that each building location has its own code. So unfortunately, at this stage, for this analysis, it's confined to one E code. So our building that we have, if I go back to this dashboard, remember we had 2 years of data. This one only has one because Tableau opened a new building last year. They don't have any data. We've obviously been around, but the way that they look at this, the city does, is that they actually look at the building more so than the company. So in this survey, they don't. That's things we've talked about in the future. Again, this was just the very first iteration. They've already started making changes to this. But that's, as far as my knowledge, that's what I know. But Heidi, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think it will be. I think companies with multiple locations, though, will want an easier, cleaner way to compare.
Yeah, so it's a great point, and somewhere they're going. They piloted it out at a Washington State commute benefit breakfast and showed it to the whole city, and people were already coming up with different ideas, and so I'm out now, I'm done. But I'm hoping that's where they take it. Good question, yeah. Yeah.
I also live in the Seattle area, and a 5-mile commute from the north side is very different than a 5-mile commute from the west side versus the south. Did you end up calculating commute time based on zip code? I know distance is a fairly easy calculation, but time is quite different.
Did you shudder at that image of the traffic? We didn't. I mean, we have all sorts of ideas on places we could take this. They don't, at this point, they didn't even have that question in there on how long it takes you, but you're spot on. And again, if you look at we anonymize this data, but this map isn't telling us a lot, right? There's one dark cube and everything else is not. So we've actually put some logic into it to show a little bit more depth in regards to population, but at this point, that's not a question that we could handle at this stage, but yeah, it's something that, again, it's going there. Yeah.
And if you are in the city of Seattle, you can contact Commute Seattle, and they will give you your code if they haven't already, but they're in the process of rolling this out. Okay.
WashDOT's asking about it, so they might get there. So, yeah. Oh, geez. We'll go to the back first. Yeah. Sorry, Morgan.
So, kind of follow up on that question.
Yeah.
Have you considered potentially bringing in outside data that tracks commute times on average during certain times of the day to go to blend it with your existing data set?
Yeah, that was one of the first questions we asked, and they didn't. I couldn't bring any. They had a certain amount of data that they could get their hands on, and at this stage, they don't have that yet. These are all things that they got to work with all their different partners to get. It was just pulling teeth to get this data, let alone anything else. That was one of the first things we talked about. Like, how cool would it be to actually show time of day? If you look at a traffic cam, right, you can actually see you go to WashDOT website, you can see, what's my commute time on average for that. We would love to do that, especially with shapefiles, and bringing in linear shapefiles would be a really cool way to show it. But at this stage, we didn't have it yet. Yeah. There was one more. Yeah.
275.
And when you were showing the benchmarking, is it here's your company versus the average of all others, or it's a little hard to see back here?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I know. That was my fear. And everyone likes to sit in the back. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so what it shows is, and I'll tell you, we weren't going to go here, but we actually duplicated the data source, because how do you calculate percentage of other companies when you're only showing one company data? So if we're asking about Tableau, do we provide shuttle, and we lock it down to just that company, it's going to show 100%. So we did duplicate the data and apply it as a row level filter to show percentages of all companies. So a little different technique, but that, if you can see on the top, this top row, 25%. So we did a count of companies that answered yes, divided by the count of all 275, and that gives us our percentage within that neighborhood. And the one on the right is within technology. So of all IT, or all technology companies, all healthcare companies, all, that type of thing. So it's just the percentage of people that offer it. Morgan?
Yeah, I was curious, has this dashboard or is any of this data that you used been going to Metro and asking for additional routes for route coverage? Because I know that with Seattle, they've been doing a lot of restructuring of routing, so I just thought that'd be an interesting use case.
Yeah, one of the hospitals has already met with Metro and said, look, we've got these big holes in the transit system, and we clearly have a lot of employees that are coming from this area, so can we get better service here? And the partners would like to do more with this as well. Like, they would really love to be able to use this as a public dashboard that people can maybe not be digging into companies like benchmarking, but really be able to show some cool stuff about the region and make some projections for the future.
Yeah.
Does the survey include any open-ended response? And if so, were you planning to use it, and how? Because that's my current survey.
It does, and we haven't used it.
There were a few questions that actually in the first version that we had, we used it. We did, so actually, there were some that we didn't end up using. You're right, it's tricky doing kind of, how do you want to group those fields and doing it that way.
Well, and then even, I haven't been able to figure out how to get Tableau to address a text box full of content beyond, I can barely make the word cloud work
Yeah.
the way I want it to. So I don't know if it's just that the technology isn't there yet. Maybe bugs boards about it, but
I won't get too deep into it. There are some techniques. In general, it's hard. When you've got long paragraphs full of data, you can do various calculations to look up for a certain keyword or something like that. But if it's completely open-ended, that's one of the reasons we didn't use some of these questions, is because it was just really messy, and keeping it simple and easy to use as well for Commute Seattle, we didn't use them. They're mostly yes or no. Or there's limited responses, like how did you commute to work every day? They did it as a numeric system versus the way that they structure the survey for that exact reason. Rather than saying, how did you get to work? And people could type a bus or bus. They just do 1 through 16. Yeah. But we can talk after. I have a couple things. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, front.
So has Tableau changed any of your practices and your benefits as a result of this?
We're using the benchmarking to make some budget requests. We've had the tool finalized for maybe 4 months now. But in addition to planning, looking at the mapping for the shuttle route, we also have an employee shuttle, just one shuttle that does a number of different things. And so it goes between our buildings during the middle of the day, but it connects to transit and to our other Kirkland location at other times of the day. And so we're using that map to try to figure out where could we maybe purchase some parking outside of the city on the east side. We could pick up some folks because there's holes in the transit system out there. So yeah, we're looking at our employer shuttle and trying to figure out what's the next place we could go with that.
Yeah.
So this dashboard up here, does it have, is one of those about work from home options? Is that something that you're rating when you're switching over? And then kind of tied to that, the two questions that you asked were the ones you really get sense about how many employees are working from home on any number of those days.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, we did. So the last option is telework, telecommute, remote. So do you offer that, yes or no? Again, unfortunately, I got out of the process as it's starting to really iterate now and take off with more questions that are being included. At this stage that I worked with, it was a yes or no option, and then we took the percentage number of that company. So how many people are at the company, how many people responded to the survey, and then they had a calculation for saying, you know, of those people, how many selected yes, and then scaled it based on how many employees they have. So again, if you've got 50,000 people and only 1,000 took the survey, it may not be as representative as you'd like, but they have a baseline for how they look at that. Yeah.
I lost the cursor. I was
Yeah,
going
it's-
to show
you gotta
on
go
the
over here.
map.
It's over here.
Oh.
There you go.
I was just going to show on the map where the telework comes in. So it's part of other, and if you hover, it will tell you
Scroll
what's
down just
in
a bit.
other. So telework, another other, and compressed work week.
So they give employees different options, and then the employer is just a yes, no, do you offer that option? So you combine the employee and the employer data to get a more thorough understanding. Yeah.
Cool.
Any others? Yeah. Yeah.
So, and those are like for each company, I assume there are a lot of things they don't provide the following items. So is there any relationship between each item with the first two questions you asked, like sort them and then see with for each company which one should we go first and which one should we do?
Yeah, good question. Make it more dynamic. The reason we didn't is because we were explicitly told that we want to print this and people want to keep it not as interactive as you might like. So I would love to have a top 5 filter or select, your top 5 or, the top 5 based on the rest of the area. But at this stage, they want it to be something tangible that they can to employers as well. So we had to show everything at one time. We don't necessarily have a sort, and a lot of that is because the data on the left, the question and the yes or no response, because we put that filter that I was talking about, that you're only showing one company's data, you can't really sort by most popular answer because it's only that company's data, yes or no. But they had a very specific request. It's actually just alphabetic, the way the questions are answered, but they were really particular as to how they were grouped, how they were structured, so I couldn't toggle too much with making it more dynamic as we may like. Yeah. Yeah.
How often do you collect this information and do the survey?
Employers are currently required to survey every 2 years, which is kind of a problem because if you're making all these program changes, it's not frequent enough. And so the state is in the process of trying to redesign the survey and is looking at more of an annual basis or maybe even a shorter survey that companies can take every 6 months if they want to. So that'll help a lot.
Got it. And just from a sampling perspective, are you guys doing anything up front just to make sure that from a survey fatigue perspective, you're not skewing the results one way or the other? Is that something that's done in that process?
No, I don't think so, unless I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, it's actually just, you get an email in your inbox as an employee. They just send it out to the entire company.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how some employers, percentage-wise, the employees, tons fill them out, and some get a really low number. So from a sampling perspective, they could do a lot better, but that's kind of out of our hands. I don't know how Heidi does
Well,
a
we're
lot more.
required to
with
get a 70% response rate, so I email people and then I pull out the people that already did it and then I keep just going at it, offering gift cards and stuff until I get to
commute
70%.
benefits. But some of the numbers were definitely higher and lower than others. So yeah, there's definitely ways they can improve it, but all these different entities working together, it's difficult.
And are you guys going to be adding a parameter to the dashboard to choose the size of the organization? So if I'm an enterprise of 200,000, I don't want to be compared to an enterprise of 50 because it's an apples and oranges.
Yeah, they want to go that way. One of the problems they had originally was that it's really difficult to make people anonymous when you're comparing within a region and you're a giant company. So one of their concerns was, giant tech company right at the bottom of Lake Union. There's one really, really large company in Seattle. It's really obvious when it's 50% on the other person. So they want to keep it as anonymous as possible, and that's one reason they didn't do that, because there were some really large companies that would skew that data. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. I know everyone's going to go enjoy themselves, have dinner, have a drink. If you don't mind filling out the survey on your app, I know you're tired of people telling you that, but it helps us get better. That would be awesome. We'll stick around if you have any questions. Thank you guys very much. It was fun. Have a good rest of your conference.